There would have been an awareness, I think, of social issues and political issues in the house. It wasn't something that was very heavy-handed. I always just had an awareness of what was going on. It's not like I was the kind of child who read a newspaper, but I just would have been aware of political events in the country. And I suppose growing up in Ireland in the 80s, it was hard not to be aware. I mean, there was so much happening in the news then. I think we were all really aware. So as well, when I was in school, I would have had a friend whose mother was very politically active, and she would have been protesting against Magdalen laundries. And this was in the early 90s when there were still Magdalen laundries open. So I suppose that's where kind of my interest for social issues would have come from.
That was Sorcha Glackin, and this is Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee, and this is Irish Stew. Today's episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Ogham Art, where you can find original prints, jewelry, home decor, and custom gifts featuring Ogham, the first written form of the Irish language. Visit oghamart.com, and that's OGHAMART.com, and listeners can save 20% at oghamart.com using coupon code Irish Stew. That's OGHAMART.com.
Hi, this is Martin Nutty, and you're listening to Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation. I'm joined by my co-host, John Lee. John, who we got coming on today?
Well, Martin, today on our Global Irish Conversation, we have a storyteller in video, someone who produces and directs. And a lot of her work has been in a kind of journalism zone, documentaries, a lot of social consciousness and seriousness behind that work. And she also, like a lot of the creative people we talk to, has other balls in the air, and she works in a business context in something called branded digital content, which we'll find out about a little bit later as well. So, as a storyteller, as someone who has, advanced in a career internationally, she seems like she has everything we're looking for in an Irish Stew guest. So welcome, Sorcha Glackin.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. And we're this was kind of a while in the making. The way this happens, it's a completely digital relationship here. Sorcha reached out to the Irish Business Organization that I'm involved in on Facebook, had a query. So I responded to the query. We went back and forth a little bit, and I said, that name really is familiar to me. And I looked, and we were connected on LinkedIn. So, okay, I make a lot of LinkedIn connections. Where did that happen? And I looked back, I checked my email, and I saw we were in touch with each other in 2012.
Really? And what was that for?
I was on the board of the Irish American Writers and Artists, which annually has the Eugene O'Neill Award, and you were working on a Eugene O'Neill documentary.
I know.
So you got in touch, and we went back and forth. I hate to say, looking at the email trail, there were a lot of like, oops, sorry, Sorcha, I didn't get back to you in time. And then you had one, oops, I'm in New York now at the moment. So anyway, so it goes back a ways.
Yeah, that was a real passion project for me. And actually, unfortunately, it still hasn't happened. And it's kind of one that kills me because people at home in Ireland don't really know a huge amount about Eugene O'Neill. And to me, that's kind of such a travesty because he attached such importance to his Irish heritage. So I really kind of wanted to bring that home. So it's still something that I'm determined to make happen. It's just taken a while.
I was trying to remember, and I hope I'm attributing this quote correctly to him, but something about what you say, what people don't understand about me is I'm Irish.
Yeah.
Did you run across a quote, something like that?
Yeah, it's what the critics missed about me. The one thing the critics miss about me is the fact that I'm Irish. So right. I think his Irishness kind of informed a lot of his work and his understanding of being Irish. And I suppose the family connections and his father's alcoholism and I suppose his family's dysfunction, for better or for worse, he attributed that to their Irishness and maybe their Irish experience in America. So I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard of him before I went to the States, and we're so quick to claim people in Ireland that I just find it funny that we haven't claimed him for whatever reason yet. So hopefully that happens in the future.
Well, the Irish American writers and artists were, they were kind of like looking at a different identity separate from Irish. What's the Irish American identity? And they really gravitated towards him. And I mentioned another guest we had from, we'll find out where you're from, but from where you originated from, Turlough McConnell, who was Eugene O'Neill's one of his most important touchstones in his kind of creative world. So, well, there's our origin story of us meeting and us luring you on to Irish Stew. Let's head over to Martin to find out like where you're from and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, no, Sorcha, we like to usually investigate people's origin story because we usually find that kind of informs their career, longer term. So you were telling me a little bit before we got on about your origin story, but can you fill the listeners in a little bit on that?
Okay, so well, I'm from Dublin first and foremost, so I'm a very proud Dub, but there would have been a very strong influence from County Donegal in our house. So my paternal grandfather and my paternal grandmother both came from Donegal and both came from Gaeltacht speaking areas in Donegal. So Irish was their first language, and my relations who still live up there, Irish would be their first language. So I was raised with Irish. I did all of my schooling through Irish. I did my exams through Irish. So that would have been kind of my background. And as well as that, there would have been a very strong musical influence in the house. So my father's a traditional Irish musician, and so are my uncles, and they learned from my grandfather, and my grandfather learned from his grandmother. So I suppose heritage and culture would have played a huge part in my upbringing. But as well as that, there would have been an awareness, I think, of social issues and political issues in the house. So it wasn't something that was very heavy-handed, but I always just had an awareness of what was going on. So it's not like I was the kind of child who read a newspaper, but I just would have been aware of political events in the country. And I suppose growing up in Ireland in the 80s, it was hard not to be aware. I mean, the news, there was so much happening in the news then. I think we were all really aware. So as well, when I was in school, I would have had a friend whose mother was very politically active. And, she would have been, protesting against Magdalen laundries. And this was in the early 90s when, there were still Magdalen laundries open. So I suppose that's where kind of my interest for social issues would have come from.
Just to kind of fill in our listeners a little bit that may not be kind of familiar with the Magdalen laundries, I think there certainly are three major scandals that have emerged in Ireland probably since the early 90s. There was the clerical child abuse problem, sadly sexual in nature. There was the Magdalen laundries, which if you'll fill us in on that. And then I think finally we could talk about the industrial schools.
Yeah, well, oh my God, the industrial schools, it's funny because when I worked on Liveline in RTE, I'm not sure if you're aware of Liveline, but it's a huge institution here. Sure. Its presenter is Joe Duffy, and he just has his finger on the pulse of the nation, but it's kind of where we go to, I suppose, to have discourse over the issues of the day and really to play out where people fall down on different things. And one of the stories that we would have covered when I worked on it was the publication of the Rhine Report. So that was the report that documented the extent of these abuses in these industrial schools. And it was really horrific stuff. And I think what the nation has kind of grappled with is the fact that most people kind of knew. And I think that that's what's been very hard for Irish people, because we like to portray ourselves as, this caring and kind nation, which we are. But there has been a huge, there's been a huge tendency to turn a blind eye to stuff. So I remember when you would be younger, one of the industrial schools near where I lived was Artane. And, you'd be told, you'll be put up there with the bowl boys in Artane. And that was a saying, so people kind of knew that these children weren't having a great time. And it's funny actually, because it's probably not funny, but it turned out after my own grandfather passed away, we never realised, but he'd actually been in an industrial school and he hadn't told us. So he had been in one of the industrial schools, Carrigley, in Dunleary, which had been named in the report. So, and he never said it when he was alive. It was only after he passed away that we found out. But he was a very, he would have been very critical of the church in the 80s, which wasn't the done thing in Ireland. So it all kind of made sense afterwards. But yeah, it's something I think we still, we probably still need to examine in Irish society. There was actually a programme on there the other day on RTE about illegal adoptions. Where Eamon de Valera's son was facilitating illegal adoptions with where children would be given to middle class couples and just being taken from women kind of without, really not their permission, but without their wanting. So that's something, and a lot of these families haven't been able to get information with regards to their birth parents because the state won't give it to them. So we're still grappling with a lot of that stuff,
Well, let's get into, how these issues became kind of what you worked on. You mentioned turn a blind eye, and that's kind of the opposite of what you do in a lot of your work. But, you started off with a degree in history and politics at UCD, University College Dublin. And then a couple of years later, you're in your master's program in journalism at Dublin City University. Was the journalism thing always on your mind? Was it something that arose after you finished UCD?
I suppose it's funny because there's two, because of my interest in social issues and politics, it was something that was always there. But then I always kind of had a creative element as well. So it probably made sense that I ultimately ended up in documentary. But when I went to study history and politics in UCD, it was really kind of to give me, I suppose, a few more years before I made that decision as to what I would actually and ultimately do. So I remember when I was in UCD, when we were graduating, everyone would be kind of saying, what are you doing? What are you going to do? And most people were going into some sort of a business environment. And I almost felt like, God, I should be doing that. So when I came out of UCD, my first job was actually in an insurance company. And if ever there was somebody not suited to the world of insurance, it's myself. So that lasted about a year. But it was actually, I think sometimes those jobs can be a great experience because you learn what you shouldn't do. And I think sometimes it can be great to learn that very early on. And I learned very early on that I probably wasn't going to thrive in a structured 9-to-5 environment and that I would need a bit of variety in my day. And I realized that working in something like journalism, I would have that variety and also that challenge. And I do like researching and I do like reading and I love meeting people and I love hearing people's stories, and then I love being able to tell those stories. So I did the journalism, I did the insurance company for a year, and then decided I wanted to go back and do the master's. So I actually ended up teaching for a year in a primary school because I had Irish, and there was a shortage of Irish teachers. So I did that and actually loved it, but then went on to do the master's in journalism.
Can I ask a little bit about the Irish thing? I'm just curious. Did you go to school in Coláiste?
No, but my father did. So I went to school in Scoil Catriona, which would have been kind of the female equivalent, yeah.
There's a reason why I'm asking. Both my father and two of my nieces went to Coláiste. So
really?
just for the listeners, there are a couple of what we call Gael schools in Dublin. Now, Dublin isn't a heavy Gaelic-speaking area within Ireland, but there are people, let's say, that are much more deeply rooted in Irish tradition, and that would be important. And certainly that was the case in my family.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's interesting that they both ended up going to school in the Scoil School, which actually no longer exists in its original building, which is in Parnell Square.
Which is such a huge shame because it was a huge institution as well. It's a real shame that it's gone.
I believe it's been relocated out in Cabra.
That's true, yeah. But I think the building itself is kind of falling into disrepair when you see it, which is,
it is an old Georgian building, very beautiful. I have no idea what's going to happen to it. It's if anybody ever goes to visit Dublin and they go to the Hugh Lane Gallery, they'll find it actually on the same block as Coláiste, and that whole block is really pretty, as is a lot of Dublin's Georgian buildings. But let me steer this back a little bit. I'm interested in the notion of storytelling.
Sure.
And I'm also interested in the fact that you studied history, because fundamentally, I don't think you can be a good journalist slash storyteller, because I kind of equate those two things without a grounding in history. And so how did that inform your work going forward?
I suppose, how is it? It just gives you a good grounding, really, on why things happen and patterns. And it gives you an understanding, I think, of how situations escalate. And you see history repeating itself. And I suppose when you have a grounding in history, it almost motivates you when you see certain things to kind of want to tell that story, because you hope that in communicating that to people, that maybe sometimes, people can chart a different course. So yeah, it was a fantastic grounding to have. It just gives you an understanding, I think. I think to be a journalist, I think you need to have some sort of a grounding in some sort of another subject, whether it's business or, the arts or something, but you just need to have a grounding. I think you can't, journalism, when it comes to, I never really know if it's something that you can actually be taught. It's great to go and to do these courses and to learn the basics, but a lot of the time it's actually, it's just getting out there and doing it, and it's getting experience. But it's having something to say and knowing what it is you're going to say and where the background and the facts of that come from.
Sorcha, maybe you could take us through some of the first steps in your career in journalism. And, I think one decision that you seem to have made early was, which side of the camera you were going to be on. It always seems to be kind of part of the, journey of people working in video, television, journalism. What was some of the early stages and early decisions for you?
Sure. Well, yeah, I never really had an ambition to be in front of the camera or to be a presenter. And I think that's just more, I just probably didn't want the pressure of carrying things. There's a bit of a luxury in being able to hide behind a screen or hide behind a camera. So when I graduated from DCU, I was very lucky to get an internship in RTE. So I spent 7 years there, and really, when I look back on it, I was so fortunate with the people I got to work with, because I got to work with really the giants of Irish journalism. So I got to work with people like Pat Kenny, the late Marion Finucane, the late Jerry Ryan. And then after about 4 years there, so I was initially working as a researcher, I started to work as a producer, and I spent 4 years producing Liveline with Joe Duffy. And that was just... I just learned so much from Joe. You could never be lazy and work for Joe, and like I said, he just has his finger on the pulse of the nation. And it taught me a lot about working with contributors. It taught me a lot, and this came from him, about respecting contributors, and it was a great place to learn.
So let me ask you this, out of sheer unadulterated ignorance on my part. The word producer means many different things in different contexts. So can you tell me exactly what that kind of meant in the RTE context and your experience?
I'm probably trying to figure it out myself some of the time. Well, yeah, and that's been something, to be honest, that I've probably struggled with a bit. So when I worked as a producer in RTE and radio, that was very much, you would direct studio, you made all the calls when it came to editorial. You were very much, when it was your day to produce, you were directing everything that happened. And if anything went wrong, if anything went wrong legally, I would have been the person in the dock. So when I left radio and I moved to television, in television, the role changes so much. It depends on what job you're working on. So I think when I initially arrived into television, I was so used to being fully in charge of content and really directing in a way. So I would have arrived to some roles, I think, where people were kind of going, who does she think she is? Because I would have had very clear ideas about content and direction when people weren't expecting that from me. But then having said that, there were other roles where that was expected. And then there's a funny thing as well, and it's something I probably haven't discussed too much with people, but there's also in television, and I don't know if there's much in the States, because I know a lot of male producers in the States, but in Ireland, there seems to be this kind of division between women are producers and men are directors. And that doesn't necessarily mean that women are not directing. So, there have been jobs where, I will have directed and I'll have gone out and I've done the interviews and I'll have overseen an edit, which is directing, but I will get called a producer and men get called a director. So that's a funny thing as well. So it can also be, so it can be a creative role, it can be a project management role. It just depends. So you almost have to find it, you have to feel it out on every job. And that can be difficult because, you can have different expectations of it, and the person you're working with can have different expectations of what they're expecting from you.
Yeah, so I got a double barrel question. Okay. First of all, obviously you're making some kind of contrast between experiences in Ireland and experiences in America. So I want to talk about that obvious transition where you made the move from Ireland to America. But I also want you to kind of speak to the challenges, maybe let's call them gender-based challenges within working in the visual journalism environment. You as a young Irish woman, trying to make your way through this, what are some of the difficulties that you faced? I don't know which one of those you want to take first.
Okay, well, I suppose I'll talk about my time in the States. So I was a full-time staff member in RTE, so for 7 years. But I'd gone in there when I was quite young. I think I was maybe 24. So I made the decision to leave, which was actually it was a very daunting decision because, when you get the job in RTE, everyone's like, oh, that's great. You have the job for life. Brilliant. So leaving it was very daunting. And I really enjoyed my time in RTE and I got to work with really fantastic people, but I just had this sense, and it was a real gut decision because had I thought about it in my head, I would never have done it because it made no sense. Because at this stage I'd only worked in radio, so it really kind of was the biggest show in town when it came to radio. So I made the decision to leave, and I didn't have a plan. It was just a real gut decision, and I kind of knew that it was going to be a difficult time after I left. So I decided that I should do some sort of a course just to keep structure on my days for the initial time that I left. So I decided to do a course in the New York Film Academy. So it wasn't for any other reason really than to just have that structure. And I always had an interest in film. So I went over and I did that. And I spent time in New York and I absolutely loved it. And that was around 2012. And I was there for the guts of a year. And that's when I kind of started developing my own projects initially. So I developed a documentary about Father Edward Flanagan. I don't know if you know about him from Boys Town, a fantastic man. And also Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones. So I was doing that. And then out of nowhere, really kind of quite fortuitously, I got offered a job on The Voice of Ireland. So that was the Irish version of The Voice, which you guys have over there, with the chairs that turn around. So I went back to Ireland, worked on that for a few years, ended up in documentaries, but then went back to America in 2016. So I was working on a project that got funding from the Arts Council when we were filming up in Rochester, New York. So we were filming a project up there, a feature documentary called Photo City. And obviously Rochester is hugely connected to photography because of Kodak. So that was a really interesting project. And then I was also working on a project in Honduras. So it kind of made sense that it was for an Irish company. So I was based in New York, but traveling down to Honduras. I was also down in El Salvador, and and traveling back and forth to Rochester. So I was doing that, and then it was around the time Trump got elected. So there was no shortage of people coming over looking for producers to help them with projects. So I was doing that also. So that's how I ended up in the States, and I really love it actually, and I miss it at the moment because I would usually make a few trips a year. So this has really clipped my wings over the last year.
Sorcha, it's funny you mentioned Rochester. One of our early guests was a gentleman named Jeffrey Hazlett, who was the chief marketing officer at Kodak in the sort of final glory days of Kodak. Wow. He was there before Kodak had its Kodak moment and kind of slipped off the radar. So I'm familiar with the sort of post, that kind of industrial scene of empty factory buildings of Rochester. Spent some time there. But, you mentioned a lot of places here in America, and, maybe we could get into what it was like to be Irish when you landed in New York. who did you run into? What did your Irish accent do for you one way or the other? And then maybe how New York contrasts with the rest of America you saw through your Irish lens.
Yeah, well, when I arrived in New York initially, I was probably still shell-shocked from leaving RTE. So my initial experience of New York was in the New York Film Academy. So I was, it was international students. So that was a really nice way, I suppose, I'd obviously been to New York before, but it was a really nice way to experience New York living there, because there was this kind of collective excitement from everybody in the school who was there as well. So that was really lovely. And I was living with a friend of mine, Niamh Sweeney, who she's working for WhatsApp now, but she'd spent a lot of time there. So there's kind of been a gang of us who have spent time there, and there's definitely an Irish gang of us now at this stage. And after I'd been over there, one of my very good friends, Samantha Barry, I'm not sure if you've heard, you probably know Sam. She editor-in-chief of Glamour magazine. So Sam was over there in 2016, and Orla Farrell and friends of mine, Fionnuala Delahunty, and there was just a huge gang of us. But I mean, look, being Irish in New York, there's definitely a currency attached to it, and I suppose more so than anywhere else in the world, really, because I've been to other places and it doesn't, like I spent time living in Australia, and it doesn't matter as much that you're from Ireland. But in New York, there's a really nice sense of belonging to the community. And I remember when I was over there the first time, and actually everybody who was doing the course with me initially left. So I'd had this period of like this huge bonding period with all these international students, and then they all suddenly left. And I remember going, oh dear, I didn't make any friends with people who live here. So now I'm kind of by myself. And I remember going up to, is it the Ashling Centre in the Bronx? Right. And just volunteering to do their feeding the homeless with them. And that was just it was a really nice thing to do, but it also just made me feel like part of a community, and felt like, you're never kind of really alone. If anything goes wrong, there's always that sense that there is a community there for you, which is very comforting, I think, when you're living away from home like that.
Yeah.
Probably unique to New York. There's a few major Irish cities where you'll find, American cities where you'll find that kind of Irish community connection. Yeah. But New York would be tops.
And I actually have to put the Irish American Historical Society in that as well. That was I absolutely loved it there. I remember because I went to meet them to speak about the Eugene O'Neill project, and I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this building is phenomenal, and it was just, I was so proud of it when I walked into it. So that was a place I used to go and feel very at home as well, which was really nice.
That certainly opens up a conversation that John and I have been engaged in. I don't know if you're familiar with, but that building is actually up for sale at the moment.
I know, I saw that. That's so, yeah, I was so sad to hear that. It would just be a travesty to let that go, like what a kind of jewel in the crown for the Irish American community over there, just even its location, everything about it, and it just has such potential in terms of a place where we can be, sharing our culture and our history, and in such a positive way. I think would be a travesty to lose it.
Just for the people who aren't in New York, the American Irish Historical Society is on Fifth Avenue, right across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's just a beautiful, one-time private residence. It's a primo piece of real estate, and also just like a point of pride for the Irish that somehow we managed to get this building.
Yeah, just to come on top of that, well, I'll start off by saying the asking price is over $50 million, but I kind of question the real estate values in our current COVID-depressed environment. But also there is actually a list you can sign up with where you can encourage Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, who apparently has the final say-so on the sale of this building, not to sell. And I believe more than 7,000 people have signed that particular petition already. And we'll put it in the show notes. I think this is something that's important, certainly to me, certainly to John, and I'm glad to hear it's important to you as well. Certainly. Yeah,
it's something I'd love to kind of get more coverage for over here, because I think if people realised, over here what we were potentially going to lose, I think people would be quite animated about it.
Yep, I agree with that. But just going back to your kind of earlier work in the States, you kind of refer to the fact that you were had a couple of projects where you were working on a documentary of Edward Flanagan and also of Mother Jones. I'm kind of curious. Young Irish woman, New York City, has this, let's call them slightly left-wing sensibility oriented documentaries. How do you manage to secure funding for those kind of things, and what are the challenges faced?
Yeah, well, these were projects that were funded by. So in Ireland, we have the Broadcasting Authority. So we all pay a license fee here, and quite like what happens with the BBC, our license fee funds RTE. And yeah, I think sometimes when I explain that to Americans, they think immediately like of Russian state media, but it's to try to ensure actually that media remains unbiased. So when we have elections in Ireland, for example, like there's literally, and I remember this from working in RTE, there's literally somebody with a stopwatch timing how much you will speak about different parties, because everyone has to get their fair share. So some of the license fee funding goes to RTE and some of it goes to the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. So that's to fund documentaries that are seen to be in the public interest. So there can be documentaries with historic merit, that are of social significance, and they can also be of entertainment value. It's just to make sure that quality program is being made. But it's quite a difficult process to get funding for those. Like you practically, like your applications will be 30 pages long, 40 pages long. Like, so you'll nearly have made the program before you put in the application. So you'll have done a lot of research. But yeah, with people like Father Edward Flanagan and Mother Jones, I suppose what drew me to them was it's more so they're people who made a big difference, and they're people who stood by their convictions, and that's what interests me. And I don't know that it's necessarily that they would come down on the left side of things. It's more so that they're people, like for example, Father Edward Flanagan made a visit to Ireland in 1946, and he toured our industrial schools and he toured our reform schools, and he spoke out about them. He said that they were unchristlike, and he criticised Irish people. He said, what the conditions in these places are like, and this is unchristlike. And he was, I think it was the Minister of Justice at the time, said he was exaggerating. And this was 1946. Like I said, I think the last Magdalen Laundry here closed down in 1995. It was really only the early 2000s that the full extent of what went on became known. So for this Catholic priest in 1946 to speak out about things like this, I just thought that was, for me, I suppose you can have an opinion of what it is a Catholic priest represents. And for me, he exhibited that you can't judge a book by its cover. He was actually very forward thinking, and he was actually very liberal, but he just so happened to be a Catholic priest.
Yeah, he's an interesting character. Of course, is the famous quote that's attributed to him, something to the effect of "There is no such thing as a bad boy."
I know, fantastic.
Which is, this is a guy, I believe, that was born in about the 1870s, and that's a very kind of forward-looking thing. And of course, he's the founder of Boys Town, which is out in Nebraska. And compared to the industrial schools in Ireland, a lot of the industrial schools have big old high walls around them. I think industrial schools is somewhat of a euphemism. Mm-hmm. Let's call them what they were. They were places of penal servitude.
Sure.
And people were essentially imprisoned. Whereas Boys Town was absolutely the opposite. It didn't have any walls around it.
They had a mayor. They elected a mayor. They would have a boy mayor in Boys Town, and they would elect a mayor, and that would be one of the boys, So it very much felt like a home. And I actually got to go and visit Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska, the original one. And there was just such a nice atmosphere. And I got to meet some past residents, I suppose you call them. Like I met a man in his 80s, and it had just been they'd come from such difficult backgrounds, and Boys Town just provided them with a place of such care and safety. And he kind of, Father Flanagan, he really did revolutionize the way we look after children, and just that idea that there's no such thing as a bad boy, only a bad environment. And he really believed that. And I think that came from, he used to work initially with homeless men. And I think he found it that, you know, there was very little he could affect with homeless men. And I think he realized that by that point, unfortunately, in somebody's life, it can be very hard to change the trajectory of you know, what might happen for them. So he decided to work, you know, with children, and he did affect a lot of change.
Let me ask you this. Flanagan is clearly an interesting story. But I think Mother Jones is probably less well known in Ireland, and probably to some degree not terribly well known in America, given the nature of our politics. She's a figure that's maybe still controversial in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Yeah, so Mary Harris Jones, she was born in Cork. Her family moved to Canada during the famine. And I mean, she has some great sayings as well. What was it? I'm not a humanitarian, I'm a hellraiser, was one of the things she would say. And she lived to be 100, although people kind of question whether she lived to be 100 or not, because she was great at her own PR, and people think she actually changed her birth date because, you know, to add a few years on kind of created more of a mystique around her. But yeah, she went over in Canada, and then she was in Memphis, and she lost, very sadly, her children and her husband to yellow fever. Then she went to Chicago, where she was a seamstress. Then she lost everything in the Chicago fire. And then at that point, she joined the Knights of Labour. And like kind of the second part of her life just became this huge political activist. She organised the Children's March to the White House at the age of 66, fighting working conditions for children. I think she was arrested at the age of 76, just in the weeks before the Ludlow massacre. So she was very involved in the Cold Wars, and yeah, just again a huge figure. And it's funny because I think in Europe we're a lot more aware of our labour history than it's definitely more celebrated in Europe than it would be, I think, in the States, because I remember being kind of surprised that she wasn't more well known, not just in Ireland, but in the States as well. You know, like, although there is a magazine called after her, but it's extremely, it's very left wing.
Hey, Sorcha, when we were back at the Boys Town there, and Martin brought up the quote about "there's no such thing as a bad boy," and some of the things you mentioned subsequent to that seems to lead us right into the work Martin and I are most familiar with for you, your documentary on the Ballymun Gaelic football team. It seemed to, so many of the themes in that we were talking about with Father Flanagan seemed to come up again in that beautiful film. Take us through a little bit of that story. We really loved it. We were impressed.
Oh, thank you. So that was... that came about. So our family, we'd be huge GAA fans. So we go to Croke Park for all the matches. It's a huge thing, you know. It's like when I was a child, my father used to have posters of the Dublin team on the wall, and I had to kiss each player goodnight before I went to bed. So that's the level of it. That's a little weird. Sorry. That's what you call indoctrination. But that's where it came from. So I was reading a book to do. Philly McMahon is a huge Dublin player here, and he's from Ballymun. And I was reading his autobiography, and you know, he's done huge things. And I just saw it wasn't just a little line. He wrote about Paddy Christie, who was his coach in Ballymun. And I remember he was saying, you know, that he owed everything to Paddy Christie. And I suppose, like you say, because of my background, I just picked up on that straight away. And I started reading into Paddy and the work he did in Ballymun. And he changed like Father Flanagan, he changed the trajectory of people's lives, of these boys' lives. And I just thought it was such a great example of how, if you invest in children at a young age, and how, if you give children opportunity, you know, that it's like, opportunity is such a huge thing in life. And when you don't have it, you know, your life can just go in a very negative way. Whereas I think what Paddy did was he gave these kids opportunity, and he showed these kids, you know, what was available to them, you know, and he showed them the importance of education. And, you know, in Ballymun, I'm not sure how much you know about Ballymun, but particularly in the 90s, it was a difficult place to live. There was a huge stigma attached to coming from Ballymun. There still probably is. There's a lot of negative stereotypes about Ballymun. So I don't know if you remember the film Into the West.
Indeed.
So a lot of that would have been set in Ballymun, and Tata would have had the horse in the flats, and that just became almost a lazy stereotype of Ballymun. So anytime you'd see Ballymun portrayed on the television, it was like you had to see the horses going through the area, and it was a lazy portrayal. And actually Ballymun, where I went to school, Scoil Katrina, was just down the road from Ballymun, and a lot of kids from Ballymun would have gone to my school. So I would have spent some time there in the 90s. So I wouldn't claim to know the area, but I definitely had spent time there. So when it came to when I got funding for the project initially, I thought that I might get somebody else to direct it. But then I kind of realized that I just really didn't want somebody else coming in and who didn't know the area. And like I said, I wouldn't claim to hugely know it, but I think that sometimes people come into it with that impression and that stereotype in the back of their head, and they almost can't see anything beyond that. And they just tell that one kind of dimensional story when it comes to Ballymun.
Yeah, I think just to lay out for our listeners some of the background in Ballymun, having grown up in Dublin, the Ballymun was famous for its high-rises, which were unusual in Ireland at the time. And they were built anticipating or based on the need for housing. So if we look at kind of the historical background in Dublin, there was a lot of people living in inner city Dublin, families living in single rooms without plumbing, et cetera, and the government decided to build this development of high-rises in Ballymun. Sadly, it seems to me, the high-rises were built, but no planning was done to build a sense of community. No planning was done to make sure that the buildings were funded appropriately so they could be maintained. So the old saw about Ballymun was, great living in a high-rise or a skyscraper. Too bad if the, lift isn't working or the elevator isn't working. And that certainly, from that point forward, the lack of maintenance seemed to kind of cause a collapse or great difficulty in that community. So would that be your take on it? Would you think that's an accurate description?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was a community that was utterly neglected, really, and it was this idea that, what they did was they moved people from the inner city because a lot of the tenements in Dublin started to collapse. So they had to move people from the tenements, and not just the tenements, from other housing as well. And they moved them out to Ballymun. But they didn't, like you say, they didn't build, they didn't facilitate any kind of, I suppose, recreational activities, or they really just put people in concrete blocks. And, as human beings, we don't thrive in those kind of conditions. And, like you said, elevators wouldn't be working. It was people would be having to lift their prams up 10 flights of stairs. I think I always have this idea that, if you treat people badly, bad things start to happen. If people feel like, that nobody has pride in where they're living, well then, by an extension, it's kind of like, well, it's just a breeding ground, I think, for social problems. But it's not something I think that we have learned a huge amount from, because, at the moment in Ireland, we're just putting up estate and all these apartment blocks, and there's still not much thought being given to planning. And I think we all know that, towns that have schools and shops and, that you can build a sense of community where there's that sense of locality, they prosper, and we don't prosper. We just put people in tall concrete blocks.
And this team, the sports program seemed to be, because I was looking at it, I said, oh boy, that looks like a really rough place to live. But then I heard the stories of the people that you told, and you could see that despite it all, they were able to, create community, particularly through the athletics.
Well, that's it, you see, and I don't like it has a bad reputation because it's the same thing. You'll have a minority, and then that the minority will do something, and that bad reputation sticks. But I mean, absolutely, the people in Ballymun are fantastic, and that had been my experience in school, and that had been my experience when I went up to Ballymun as a teenager. So, yeah, there's a huge look. There's snobbery everywhere. There's stigma. I mean, you probably know, Martin, from, you know, like Dublin is quite a divided town in terms of, you know, your postcode is very important in Dublin. And it still kind of is to an extent, you know, maybe not as much, but there is kind of that weird north-south divide, which, you know, is very strange. And so, yeah, I think when you know, come from places with that kind of perceived stigma attached to it, it can be very hard to break out of it, because you're fighting against a lot, you know, and you're fighting against people's preconceived ideas of who you're going to be as well.
And that's, I suppose, to some degree, why people like Paddy Christie are so important, because they're the ones that all of a sudden open up a window and say, these opportunities are available, and provide some kind of structure, you know. So in a very unstable environment, Gaelic football provided that structure and built it into young people's lives. But the real question is how do we make more Paddy Christies?
Well, that's it. And Paddy makes a very interesting point. It's very hard, I think. You know, Paddy kind of went above and beyond, and, you know, when he would take some of the boys home and there was nobody in, he would take them out to play pool and stuff. And that's kind of difficult to do these days as a teacher, you know, for all sorts of reasons. So, you know, you need community, and people need role models. And I think Paddy understood the importance of instilling pride in people and pride about where they came from. You know, these kids were told that because of where they came from, you know, that they weren't to be respected. And this would come from adults on the sideline. Whereas Paddy, you know, he knew that they needed good kit, so he got them nice kit, and then they ended up with the best kit. And those kind of little things where suddenly they could hold their head high, and that makes it all the difference. And I think now that there's these great role models like Philly McMahon in Ballymun, I mean, it paints Ballymun in a very different light, and I think it's more than overdue.
One of the other interesting things that I noted in the film was when Paddy brought in some other young men from Glasnevin, which is obviously, you know, a better section of Dublin. And so there's a blending issue there. There was some difficulties, but I think both sides of that divide, it was a learning experience for both of them. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I identify with, because you know, I think when you go to school and places like that, I think sometimes, you know, a parent's instinct can be to buffer their child from some of, you know, the realities of the world. And, you know, they'll want to send their child to fee-paying schools. But I don't know if that, you know, I think growing up in the real world and getting to see people from all backgrounds, I think there's a huge education in that. And I know from my own school, there was a huge mix of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And it teaches you a lot about life, and it teaches you a lot about how to get on with people. And I just think that, you know, it's not always good to kind of try and just, I suppose, just live within your kind of nice postcode without mixing. And I think what Paddy did really showed the benefits of mixing, and, you know, that it doesn't help to kind of ghettoize communities and just leave them there. And I think when you do mix, and it didn't just benefit the Ballymun guys, it benefited the guys from Glasnevin as well. You know, it teaches you about life. And when you leave school, you're going to have to learn about it anyway, you know, so you might as well get your life experience in when you're younger.
Sorcha, there was a lot of great types or aspects of storytelling in this film. I kind of hit on this image in the beginning. There's a kind of shot of a swing set that's unused and rusting away, and then a little while later you see video of the opening of Ballymun, and there's the swing set is working. You know, people are on it, so it starts off with the best intentions. A lot of beautiful, you know, detail and imagery throughout. Also, great. Well-spoken, you know, great feedback from the players and the people you interviewed. And I know that's not just that they were great. I mean, you must have your role was to establish some trust and rapport and to be able to draw out these great responses.
Yeah, I mean that's very important to me when I'm making something. And like I said, that's something I definitely attribute to my time working on Liveline, because we would have been dealing with people, like I said, from who had been in industrial schools and people who'd gone through some really difficult experiences. So I really learned how important it is to respect and to gain people's trust. So, I mean, my process would be that if I intend to make something, like I'll probably meet, like I'll spend time getting to know somebody for a couple of months. And this, with making this program or this documentary, there was a huge trepidation, I think, on the part of the guys from Ballymun, because, like I said, media portrayals of Ballymun up until this point, really for the most part, would be quite lazy and quite stereotypical, and and I think they were really nervous of somebody coming in and doing that again. So it was really trying to strike that balance was something that I was very aware of. I didn't want to come in with rose-tinted glasses and say, look, this is a fantastic place and there's never been any issues here. But I didn't want to linger on that for too long either, because, like I said, there's great people there, as you can see in the documentary, and there's people doing huge things for the community. So yeah, it was definitely something I took very seriously, and it was something that it was. Yeah, I was quite stressed about it, because I was really, I wanted to do everybody in the documentary justice, and I didn't want anyone to feel like they'd been portrayed in a negative way, or I didn't want anyone to have any negative experiences after it.
Frankly, I've found the thing absolutely inspirational.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's all down to Paddy.
Hey, Mark, I just jump in with one line. There's a lot of great lines, and one that just stuck out with me. I'm going to use this in my life from here on in. You're either winning or learning. You're not winning or losing. So That's such a great perceptive thought. So
it really was, yeah. I mean, look, Paddy should be running the country, like he should be in the Department for Education, that's for sure, because he knows how to get to kids, and he knows how to connect to kids, and he knows how to get the best out of kids. And he doesn't leave, he knows he doesn't leave kids behind. And I think that's the main thing.
So let me just transition a little bit. I'm assuming that this particular movie is obviously played out in Ireland. Talk to me about the challenges of distribution for Irish content beyond the shores of Ireland.
Oh, well, look.
I don't know if it's available in the States, for example, so I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's something actually I'm exploring with a sales agent at the moment. But yeah, of course there's challenges, and especially with something, I mean, when people hear it's a documentary about GAA, they probably, they're going to think, well, that only has a certain niche audience. Whereas actually it's a documentary about a story that happens to a GAA team. I mean, really, I don't know that the documentary is necessarily about the GAA team. It's about Paddy, really. So look, our aim is for it to be distributed internationally if possible. I mean, RTE still at the moment have rights on it. So that's their ongoing discussions. But yeah, it is trying to making documentaries isn't the most lucrative thing always in the world as well. So you're just always trying to find ways to. It's a challenge to. There's that balance of making what you want to make, and then also you need to be able to earn a living as well. So trying to strike that is interesting.
So do you think RTE have an appreciation that there are over 70 million people globally of Irish extraction? Because it seems to me like I get on the RTE player, right? And I've gone to the trouble of downloading that, and I click on it, and it's like, this is not available in your country.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there's enormous opportunities that are untapped by actually going after that huge, even though a subset of the market. And why RTE haven't capitalized on that, especially through their RTE player.
Yeah.
I'd be willing to ante up a few bucks a month, so I could access the same content that Irish people access.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of people would. I mean, I know that international rights are hugely expensive. So if you have a program with Archive, like the last documentary I made was a program that was full of international rugby archive, and it's so expensive. So if you're looking for international rights, like, it just becomes unmanageable. So a lot of the time the program makers won't have secured international rights. But I mean, there's definitely something in it. I know that there was that Irish TV for a while which, unfortunately, I think it folded, but there's definitely a market for Irish content out there.
Well, we're heading towards the end of our conversation here, Sorcha. Why'd you bring us up to the present? Like, what's going on in your world now? You flagged a show you're working on that Martin and I were pretty interested to see. We think it would work big here in the U.S. as well. Why don't you bring us up to date with what you're up to and what you're working on?
So just a few days ago, a new project I was working on debuted on Irish television. So that was a format that was devised by Animo Television, and it's a really smart format, and I wouldn't be surprised if you see it in the States because it's such a simple idea. But actually, it's something that we've kind of moved away from so much. So it's called Eating with the Enemy, and it's based on a social experiment that happened in Sweden in I think it was 2018, and they got 2,000 people to sit down with each other, but just to literally sit down and have a conversation with somebody who has a different opinion to them. So it's a very simple idea, but if you actually think about it, we're just not doing that anymore. And so much of our discourse is happening on Twitter. And, if you think about it, like we've got these issues and, there's a lot of murky water that we probably need to wade through. And we're trying to, debate the issues of the day. And is it 230 characters? And really, it doesn't allow for discourse. I think people tweet things, and it's almost like I saw somebody writing recently about the gamification of society, where it's like people are tweeting stuff, and they're just formulating these tweets for likes. So it's not to find the common ground. So we're not having conversations. We're kind of just shouting at each other on social media. So the idea was to have this program, Eating with the Enemy, and to very simply just get people with opposing views to sit down and have a conversation with each other.
Yeah, I saw something recently. It was a great idea. It was a kind of a small mountain town in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, which is quite a nice area, old school New England. Created a program with a hill town in Tennessee or Kentucky, a coal mining town. Couldn't be more opposite, but still had that sort of small town vibe. And they meet every year for dinner, and they get together. So really was beautiful. We come to the part of the show that used to be called the shameless plug. And in our last conversation with Turlo McConnell, it somehow turned into the Seamus plug. But it's a chance for us to thank our guests for their time and insights to give you a chance to promote something from your end.
Yes. So my Seamus plug is, I suppose I probably have two, which might be a bit cheeky. The first one is obviously the new show, Eating with the Enemy. The first episode just went out, and that's going to run for a few weeks. So that's on Virgin Media 1 on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. But I would imagine that Animo will probably, the format will probably go internationally. So hopefully you get to see it. And then So the second shameless plug is a new project that I've just started on with a friend of mine. It's very much in its infancy, but we're looking to provide courses online and virtually for people in broadcasting and program making at kind of affordable prices. So that's called First Steps 2, and we have an Instagram page if anybody wants to follow it.
That's perfect. We'll make sure all that is in. We do a lot of social media about our episodes, so we'll plug that. We'll put it in the program notes. One quote that stuck out for me at the end of your film was talking about Paddy Christie, the coach. He put in the most precious thing we have. He put in time. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Great to get to know you finally. So, Martin, in a way, I met Sorcha about a decade ago when she communicated to me by email over a completely different project. Interesting to see, though, the Eugene O'Neill connection that she's made. Very interesting spread of activities and pursuits from Sorcha. And we've seen this before in some other of our creative workers. Really, you need to put a kind of a portfolio together of different creative ventures in order to make a success in your life. And all this coming from somebody who started in the insurance business, figured out that wasn't the right path, and found herself in journalism school after that.
Yeah, usually people that work in the domain of insurance are conservative. But I agree with you. What I think we generally see with creative types is a certain amount of courage. And Sorcha had a great job in RTE in radio, but she walked away from it because she felt she needed to push herself. Not only did she walk away from RTE, but she also walked away from Ireland. She moved to New York, which is pretty intimidating. And she enrolled herself in film school. So now she made a move from audio into a totally new domain of film. So courage is there, but also what's there is a commitment to social issues. And that really shines through in her work subsequent to her moving to New York.
Yeah, and the piece of her work that we're most familiar with is called Passing It On, about the Ballymun Kickhams Gaelic football team on the outskirts of Dublin in a housing project. And, I guess we'd say on the wrong side of the tracks, using the American idiom. But what a sympathetic portrayal, and what great voices emerged from that film as Sorcha took a stand against what she called the lazy portrayal of Ballymun. And truthfully, I was going to ask her about the horses passing through the shots, So she took a different approach and worked to tell a more authentic story. And I think it came through extremely well.
Yeah, and I think just to add on top of that, I think sometimes when people might go to look at this film, they might think it's about sport, but it's not really about sport. It's about the impact that one man can have when they make a commitment towards a community of people. And so Paddy Christie is the hero of that film. And as I said to Sorcha, it'd be great if we could make more Paddy Christies.
Well, Martin, a lot of our listeners ask how they can help spread the global Irish conversation. What do you think?
Best thing people can do to help out the podcast is to simply share the episode. If you like what you've heard so far in this episode or other episodes, share it on social media, whether that's Facebook or whether that's Twitter or whether that's Instagram, or share it via email or word of mouth. All of those things are going to help us out. And don't be shy about dropping us a note. You can do so on our website. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.